Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind Podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Christopher Browning, welcome to the Inquiring Mind Podcast.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'm a big fan of your book, Ordinary Men. Um, Obviously, if something has been around for, I looked this up. It was 29 years since the book has been published, and the fact that it's as relevant and, in some ways, more popular than it was in the beginning, that stood the test of time, which is a great thing. But before we get into the book and the content of your book, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a retired professor of history. I taught 25 years at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, and then 15 years at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And when I retired from there, I returned to the Pacific Northwest and currently live in Tacoma, Washington. And Ordinary Men was certainly the most successful book that I've written, and the one that has been selling well in a sense for, as you say, 29 years. It's in its third edition now. I've written other works dealing with broader topics of the Holocaust, Nazi Jewish policy, the decisions for the final solution, and a book that was called Remembering Survival that looked at the post-war testimonies of a collection of survivors from a Nazi slave labor camp in Poland. So it's one of a number of topics that I've worked on, but it certainly has been the one that has been commercially and academically the most long sustained and most commercially successful.
Right. Do you remember when you first fell in love with history? Was there a moment in your childhood that you remember?
Uh, Actually, I guess there's sort of two phases. Back when I was in middle school, I had a Civil War fascination phase and read lots of books about the Civil War. And then I got more interested in politics. I went to college thinking I would be a political science major, but then dropped out a year and traveled quite a bit. And in that year, I found what I really was interested in as I went from country to country was to read about the history, to understand how the country had become what it was. And when I returned to college, I took my first college history course and immediately declared a major. And I've been wedded to that topic, I guess I would say, ever since.
And have you ever thought about if you didn't become a historian and gotten that political science degree, uh, would you have been a politician or would you have gone to a think tank? Have you ever thought about that?
I presume my first choice would have been still to be an academic. I would have simply taught in a political science department as opposed to a history department. Uh, my father was an academic. My brother was an academic. We come out of a kind of academic family. So that would have been my guess is that would have been the direction things would have taken.
Yeah. What would you say is the reason people need to know history? Not just the history you read about, but in general history. Why is it so important?
It's a matter of self-understanding. If you want to understand the world that we live in, you have to know how we got to where we are now. And that if one has only the perspective of the present and you just sort of take where we are for now for granted and to assume that's the way things had to be, but not even curious about how they got to be that way, I think one has a very, very limited, blinkered view of life. And for me, then history is the major way in which we orient ourselves, in which we understand how it is that we have gotten here, what's the path that we have traveled, and that help us to understand both where we are now and to at least have some, I think, more intelligent way of assessing where we might go in the future. History is not predictive. It's not a predictive science, but nonetheless, without a historical background, I don't think you can very well even have an intelligent guess about where things are going in the future.
Mm. Do you think people in America are know their history well, or do you have problems with the way we teach history or the amount of knowledge we have?
I think we're a pretty ahistorical society. We live very much in the present, uh, and uh, and of course now we know there's also problems of those that look at history not just as to how it informs us about how we are where we are, but a politicalization of history. History will be accused of, being critical, of demeaning our national glory or our past. The current, disputes over how we will teach slavery, how it's the 1619 project, and now, of course, the weaponization of what is called critical race theory, as if it had been taught in grammar school, and now we're banning it from high school curriculums where it was never in the first place. I think shows that as is what's happening in Poland or Hungary, where they're actually passing laws about what kind of history can be written and what is considered a crime to write. Basically shows that history's taken on another dimension, which is a political dimension that's intensified recently beyond anything I've seen in the profession.
Yeah, how would you balance those sides of history? Because it seems to me that um, there's teaching slavery and there's teaching. Uh, this was best kind of shown to me. I heard one political commentator once say it's there's the difference of teaching Marxism and teaching from a Marxist perspective, right? So, how do you balance teaching the subject but not sort of indoctrinating kids or future generations?
I remember when I was a very young starting professor, assistant professor, and I went to the wedding of one of my students, and I was sitting next to the man who was the head of a chief bank in Pittsburgh. And he turned to me and said, "Did I teach Marxism or the truth?" And to which I said, "Well, I do assign in my class modern European history, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, because if you don't even know what communism is and what they're arguing, how can you possibly understand modern history?" And my intention is that they become informed and know how to understand what communism is, what it claims, how it, because you can't possibly understand what the Soviet Union was doing or where the Cold War came from if you have no clue about what Marxism is. So for me, it's the same as teaching liberalism, the same as teaching other major historical currents. If you don't understand what the major historical actors think and how they understand history, you're not going to understand where we are today and where we came from.
Mm. I completely agree with you. But do you think there's any credence to some of those concerns about people wanting to not teach certain things, not in because they don't fear the content of what they're teaching, what people are teaching, but how it's being taught. It's not taught, again, not taught as just another idea. It's taught as the truth. You know.
Um, Well, I think what I would say to that is if you're teaching, quote, the truth, you have to make clear you understand what the basis of that is. For Americans, of course, it's Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We're based on a creed. We're on a set of a belief. There's no scientific test you run. There's no litmus paper you stick in history that turns pink or blue to tell you whether Thomas Jefferson is right or wrong. It's a starting principle, and one that I agree with and one that I embrace. And I will admit that's my starting point. But I think it's important we be conscious of what our starting point is and understand how somebody who says no, class struggle is what history is all about, and that you follow the logic of Marx in that regard, or like National Socialism, you believe the history is a history of race struggle, and there are such things as races, and that pure races are strong and weak races are weak, or mixed races are weak. This is a set of beliefs that are not based upon, in a sense, well, they're in a sense a starting point from which they understand the world around them. And it's important that we understand both what we think and why we think it, but also understand what they think and why they think it, and why we think they're wrong, and what we think the very unfortunate consequences result when someone like Adolf Hitler believes that all history is race struggle, and that it justifies an unending, no holds barred war to conquer more land so your race becomes stronger and you enslave and destroy everybody else. That happens to matter if Germany's a powerful nation and he's running it, because we'll feel the consequences. So in that sense, I think it's both important to understand what our own starting point is, and liberal democracy as defined by Thomas Jefferson, I think for me is a good starting point. But I do have to be aware why other people don't share those beginning axioms and what the different resulting behavior is when they don't.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, I there's a lot to discuss in this book and in your life's work. How did you first get interested in the topic of Police Battalion 101?
I guess I would do that in two stages. First, how did I become interested in the Holocaust? And then how did I get into this particular topic? I, in fact, started graduate school working in French history, and then had to leave graduate school in the middle of the Vietnam War because I no longer had a graduate school deferment. And fortunately, my draft board was giving teaching deferments, so I taught for a while. When I was sort of on my hiatus before I returned to graduate school, I read a book by Raoul Hilberg called The Destruction of the European Jews. And at that point in the 1960s, Holocaust was not a subfield of academics. If you look at course catalogs of the 1960s, you will not find a course on the history of Holocaust at any American university or college. As a academic subject, it simply did not exist. But I was fascinated by Hilberg's book and felt if this is out there, this is an open field. I just was so said, how can this not be? These are the most important questions one could possibly deal with. I went back to my graduate supervisor when I was about to return to graduate school and said, I'd like to change my area. I want to look at, and I think the phrase they used then was Nazi persecution of the Jews. We didn't even use the term Holocaust then. That was not widespread use at that point. And explained the topic that I wanted to look at. And his response was, well, that's a very good dissertation topic, but you should bear in mind that has no professional future. Because that was a specialty no one hired in. There were no courses at any university where you would teach it, no conferences at which you would give papers, no journals in which you would publish articles. But then fortunately, he went on to say, but if that's what you really want to do, you should do it anyway, because there's no fate worse than to spend 5 years of your life writing a dissertation if your heart's not really in it. So he gave me my warning and my encouragement. And for my great fortune, in fact, by the time I finished the dissertation in the mid-70s, things were beginning to change. And by the late 70s, we had a cluster of events that kind of represented a turning point in Holocaust consciousness in the United States. That's when the NBC docudrama Holocaust was broadcast in 1978. That's when the Elizabeth Holtzman amendment to American justice policy created the Office of Special Investigation to look at Nazis who had come into the United States, or Nazi collaborators, without telling the truth about their past, and have been left basically to live undisturbed lives in the United States for decades. And they finally set up a mechanism to hunt for and investigate these people. And that's, of course, when Jimmy Carter put together a presidential commission to raise the question, how might we deal with this topic? And their recommendation was not to have some eternal flame or some monument, but in fact to build a museum. And that was the origins of the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum. Those things all came in 1978, 79. And in the 80s, then it was a growth field academically. I turned out I was a young academic on the ground floor of what became an academic growth industry. And my professor's warning that it had no professional future was quite, turned out to be quite inaccurate. It was an area where, as a young scholar, I had opportunities in an opening field that in a more established field I never would have had. One of which was that I was commissioned by Yad Vashem, which was the Israeli equivalent of our Holocaust Museum and Archive, to write one volume in a history series they were writing. And in the course of researching for that in Germany is when I was looking at all the German court records relating to trials in Germany about Nazi perpetrators in Poland related to the Holocaust. Poland had half the victims of the Holocaust, half the Jews that died were Polish Jews, but we had nothing like half the documents from Poland. It was understudied and underrepresented in the documentation. So I was tempted to fill that gap. And that's when I came across the indictment to the trial of Reserve Police Battalion 101. And just two things just sort of stunned me. One was the account of the battalion's major Trop on the morning of the first massacre they were going to conduct, when he has to tell the men what they're going to do, is struggling, crying, tears coming down his cheeks as he's telling them this, and he ends up the talk saying those that don't feel up to it can step out, they don't have to take part. Clearly there's no coercion. Nobody had to shoot unarmed women and children that day who didn't want to, and so it was a test case in which all the post-war alibis of German perpetrators, they had no choice. If they hadn't killed, somebody would have killed them. All of that has no historical evidence behind it at all. No German was ever subjected to dire punishment for refusing to shoot unarmed women and children. The second key to that was the quality of the testimony in the indictment was just so vivid and so graphic. Here were men telling about what it was really like to be engaged in a massacre in which you were shooting people at point blank range for an entire day. And I had never seen anything so graphic and so vivid, clearly not people lying to cover themselves, and that they were in great numbers. And so that's what led me to go to Hamburg to look at the court records, and turned out there were 210 men that were interrogated, because this was the rare case, the first case in which we had found the roster, or I should say the investigative authorities, had found the roster of a killing unit. So they could interrogate over 40% of the men who had been in it. And the rank and file, unlike most cases where they knew only the officers, and the officers lied for one another, here the rank and file did not cover for their officers. And they told what happened in the most horrific detail. So I had this mass of oral testimony that was so much more truthful and so much more frank about what it was like to be in a Nazi killing unit than anything that had been found in the historical record up until that time. So those two things, the fact that here this illuminated the issue of choice, and it was a court record of over 200 people, most of them willing to say things that nobody else so far had been willing to say in the post-war period about what it was like to be a perpetrator in a killing unit in the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing you just mentioned is that these men were obviously given an out, and they didn't have to do any of the shooting, yet they proceeded to commit mass murder and commit horrible acts of war crime, horrible war crimes. Why do you think that is? Why did these men decide to kill these people?
In a sense, we have to ask the opposite question. That is, the default is you will do what you're told to do, and you will do what everybody else is doing alongside you. And the real question is, why did so few people opt not to do it, to break with their comrades, to break with the policies and the the directions that the officers were giving and the tasks that the unit had been assigned. And additionally, of course, I think it was difficult for the men who had not been given prior training in this. They had not been explained that this was something that they would do when they were sent to Poland. This came as a extraordinary shock to the men. It even came as a shock to the commander. As I said, Major Trop has tears streaming down his cheeks. His voice is cracking. He's struggling to control himself physically as he's explaining to his men what he calls the terrible task he's going to ask them to do. So that these were men who were utterly unprepared. And I think for many of them, the issue was, will I hold up? Will I not be seen as a coward in the eyes of my comrades? Will I be seen as someone who's holding their own and not letting other people down? Because I think the first fear many men have in an opening action is, will I not embarrass myself? Will I not be viewed as somebody who can't be loyal to their comrades? So you had to overcome those sort of initial default positions. Not many people took up Trop's offer, but once they actually see the reality of killing and they're actually engaged in the process, the number of men who thereafter opt out grows. And over the course of time, the battalion, in a sense, breaks into sort of three groups. One group, unfortunately, becomes those people who learn to enjoy killing other human beings. There is not a plurality, but a significant minority within the unit that become absolutely cold-blooded, hardened killers who volunteer to kill, enjoy killing, go back after a killing action and sit down at lunch and have a big meal and joke about what they've done. And that's very distressing to know that there are a fair number of people out there who, when they can do this kind of thing with total impunity and in fact be rewarded for it, that is the direction that they will take. There was a larger middle group that basically didn't volunteer, but also would never say, I won't do it. So that they did what they were told, but they didn't seek opportunities to do it. They considered the work dirty, but they wouldn't say no. And that they basically did whatever anyone asked them to do. They found it easier to go along than to say, I'm opting out. And then there is another minority group, I would estimate it at around 20%, that over the course of time, either the first day, in the course of the first day, or sometime thereafter, take up the major's option and say, I won't shoot anymore. Now, they continue to do other things that support the killing. That is, they'll remain in the guarding cordons around the execution sites. They will continue to be involved in the ghetto roundups that collect Jews in towns, take them to the train, put them on trains that are sent to Treblinka, where people are murdered in gas chambers upon arrival. So it's not that they're not being accessories to murder, but they are not committing the murder themselves in the most direct way. That is, they're not pulling a trigger and blowing somebody's head off at point blank range, where they cannot escape the direct reality of what they're doing. As long as they can remove themselves even one step from a sense of being a direct killer, that seems to alleviate their sense of responsibility. Many of the interrogations, they start with, well, I was only in the cordon. I only guarded the people who were going to be killed. I didn't shoot them myself. This division of labor and even putting in one step away from direct killing seems to have a huge alleviation effect on the men. And in that sense, the major's option not to shoot made the battalion, if anything, more efficient. These people could still have tasks. They could still do things. They continued to be part of the unit. They continued to help it make it function, but you didn't have to get them to do the one thing that they found too difficult to do. Their explanations were never that this is a terrible thing, this is murder, the regime is criminal. It was almost invariably, I am too weak to do that. So that perversely, the way to get out of killing was to validate the tough guys who could kill and take upon themselves the stigma of being too weak to do it. So the avenue of getting themselves out was nonetheless to ratify, to validate what the battalion was doing and the strength, the machoism, the toughness of the guys that could do it, but taking their own personal out by saying they were too weak. That was their flaw. That was their failing. But it created the space that allowed them to get that one step away from the direct killing, even if they continued to support it. A lot of them would say, I tried to kill, or not a lot of them, but one. I remember one policeman was very explicit. It's one thing to say you won't take part. It's another thing vis-a-vis your comrades to try and not be able to. They know you didn't want to leave your friends in the lurch. You gave it a try. You were too weak. And then it was okay to step aside and you would be excused from the direct killing.
Mm. There's a lot to unpack there. I guess the question that I have, the most pressing question I have, when it comes to that last group, the group that decided that they can't kill anymore, and they'll drive the vans or they'll send people on the trains. How do we treat those people after the war? Are they the same level of criminals that the ones that did the shootings are, or are they a separate category?
Oh, I think we always have to accept a spectrum and sort of gradations of participation. Those that give the orders, those that organize it, those that encourage it are, of course, the most responsible. Those that grow to like it and volunteer for it, of course, are totally responsible. And the others are not innocent in the sense that they were not involved and didn't contribute to it. But this is where we use the term accessory to murder as opposed to murder. And that you help facilitate it. You didn't want to participate, but you did. You helped facilitate it, but it would not have happened if it had been up to you. If you were the only person upon which this depended, then the murder would not have taken place. So I think, in a sense, we have to accept that there are, and this is, there are gradations of complicity. And of course, this is all in our law codes. We have first-degree murder, aggravated first-degree murder, second-degree murder with premeditation, without intention. The Chauvin trial was second-degree murder without premeditation. So you have these, the law has sliced this into various degrees of complicity, all of which involve murder. And then below that, of course, you have various kinds of manslaughter, which is not considered murder, but is still a taking of human life that may have legal responsibilities, vehicular homicide, an auto accident in which you behave in a reckless and irresponsible way. So the law does indicate that we must slice the salami into a number of different slices. And that is what we've done in regarding virtually every other kind of crime. And I think we can do that here too.
Yeah, and what would happen? I don't know if this was the situation you brought up in your book. Say if people didn't want to commit the killings, and then they didn't want to drive the vans, could they just go home?
No, but they could ask to be reassigned.
Where would the reassignment be?
Well, in one case, we know the lieutenant who was most opposed to taking part and made clear to the major that he wouldn't, writes back to Hamburg and said he'd like to have a reassignment back in Hamburg, and eventually is reassigned. That he says his claim after the war, we apparently this was not in his letter, but he phrased it after the war, that he had told them what the unit was doing in Poland was not agreeable to him, and that he would be able to make a better contribution with some other assignment. So you don't, how these things are phrased, of course, they're living under a Nazi dictatorship, and one has to be very careful how you phrase things when you're asking for this kind of thing. But there were ways to do that. And even in the battalion, as I say, as long as you could be more inventive in distancing yourself. In the case of the lieutenant, he wouldn't go on the killing actions. So he wouldn't be in the cordon. He wouldn't round up people on the ghettos in the towns and put them on trains. So he was one step further away. Not only would he not take part in the shooting, but he wouldn't be the accessory on that day. But yet he is in the battalion helping it do its occupation duty until he gets himself a reassignment. He had probably more leeway than the rank and file, a little harder for a private to write and say, I want to be reassigned. So yes, there people did have limited leeway into how they could work the system, but there were ways to work the system, at least to some extent.
Yeah, and is that a consideration we give when deciding how uh, to how long to maybe arrest them for, or whatever their crime is? Is that a consideration at all? Saying, oh, that person was a private and he probably didn't have a real way out and he just had to do his job.
Well, certainly for the particular trial in Hamburg, in which the collection of officers and non-commissioned officers were tried, and a small number of the rank and file, who were so frank about what they had done, that even though before the trial the investigators had said, we're not after you, we're after the officers. They were so frank with what they'd done, they by German law had to be indicted. What the judge did at the trial was to say, yes, you're convicted, but I don't sentence you. I use a provision in the German law, which the judge had, to decide that no punishment was merited in this case. So a number of the rank and file were convicted at the trial and then released and given no punishment as a result. Unfortunately, for most of these post-war trials in Germany, German law was utterly inadequate to deal with the event. I mean, they would not use crimes against humanity, which was one of the charges that turned out to be very effective in the Nuremberg trials for convicting people. But Germany considered that ex post facto law, made up after the event. Now, I would argue, in fact, crimes against humanity was simply an overarching term that bundled together all sorts of things that everybody already considered a crime by international law. And the fact that you gave this a bundling name didn't mean all the different things included weren't already criminal. And it should not have been considered ex post facto law, but Germany did. And the result was they had to use the 1940 German Criminal Code. And that defined murder fairly narrowly. And they made a distinction between the perpetrator and accessory, which became separated off, and other criminal codes make that distinction too. But in Germany, to be the convicted of the murder itself, it has to be the event that you yourself identify with and do of your own will. And almost all these men said, it wasn't my will, I was obeying orders. And so the vast number of these people are on trial for accessory, not for murder. And most of the courts said, well, Hitler is a murderer, Himmler is a murderer, but the men are accessories. They were ordered to do it, and this was the government policy, and they can only be tried for accessory to murder. And then the sentences, of course, for that were much lower, and that even the officers convicted basically were given sentences ranging between initially between 8 and 5 years, and they were reduced to, I think it was 6, 5, and 3 and 4 years, in that range. And then subtracted from that would be pretrial confinement. So most of them served very token sentences after the trial and then walked out of jail very quickly.
Mm-hmm. That actually leads perfectly to my next question. What happened to these men after they served their time? When did the last man die, and how did they live out the rest of their days?
Yeah, I don't know when the last has died. We do have to remember that the rank and file are reserve policemen. These are men who didn't become eligible for conscription until 1941-42, when the Germans expanded the age length of people who could be conscripted for wartime service, even if it wasn't being drafted into the army. So in late 1941, the Germans say now anyone between 35 and 48 now can be conscripted. The Army doesn't want those people. So when these people receive their draft notice, they're sent to the reserve police. And the initial understanding is, they would stay at home giving parking tickets and so forth, and the younger professional police would go and serve an occupation duty in the East. But by the spring of 42, Germany is so short on manpower that these middle-aged men are put into Reserve Police Battalion 101 and sent to Poland, which is still far behind the lines. This is way behind the front where the actual fighting is taking place. But the average age was 39 and a half years old. So by the time I even did my research in late 1980s, these people were now, in their early 90s if they were still alive. And I was not allowed by court rules. One of the things I had to promise in order to get clearance to see the court records is I would not use the names and addresses to contact anybody or any of their families. The German privacy laws are very strict. And I'd have lost my court clearance for any further historical investigation if I had violated that and had been caught. So I worked with the written records of the 1960s interrogations 20 years later in the late 1980s, but I never contacted any of these people. A few of them contacted me. I should say that the families of them contacted me, wanting to know more about, did I know anything more about what their uncle may have done or something like that. But I couldn't contact them. But that, very likely, almost none of these people was alive at the turn of the millennium. That was by 2000. That they would have had to have been, basically 100 years old. And so I think they were, they were long gone. The younger men were the SS captains. They were high up in the Hamburg police when the investigation starts, and they receive the highest sentences. So their police careers are over. They cannot return to the police after they've served a prison term. So they suffered at least that, additional inconvenience to their life, as they couldn't be a policeman having been convicted of murder or accessory to murder in Poland. Many of the men after World War II simply went back and did what they'd done before. And those were, for the most part, unskilled manual labor. The people they drafted at that point were ones who were not vital to the war economy. If you were a skilled engineer or machine worker building submarines in Hamburg, they're not going to send you to Poland. But if you're a truck driver or a restaurant waiter or a warehouse worker or a store clerk, those middle-aged people were the ones that they drafted and sent off. And so people returned to those kinds of positions. Some who had done particularly well did try to make a police career after the war. And so along with the two SS captains, there were others who were in the Hamburg police after the war from 101. And they, of course, could not continue in those careers after the trial.
Mm-hmm. And when, I don't know if you're allowed to discuss this, but when the families of the perpetrators reached out to you, were you allowed to respond?
Oh yeah, if they contacted me, I could okay. Respond.
And what was that interaction like?
Well, I can give you two stories.
Yeah, it could be as vague as you don't have to give me details that you're not allowed to give, obviously.
No, these I can give. It gives you a sense of how this sort of correspondence went. Yeah. I received a phone call from somebody in New Jersey who had emigrated to the United States in the 1950s as a 10-year-old with his mother, and had never been told about, other than his father did not come back from the war, but he was from Hamburg. And then he read the review of the book and read the book. And then he did have his father's letters. And he did, looking at the postmarks of the letters and the towns he was stationed in, immediately realized his father had been in 101. So I asked him, well, what did the letters say? And he says, well, actually, they say almost nothing at all. I mean, they say how the weather is and whether they had any good food to eat, totally banal. And he says, at one point, his father tells his mother, what we are doing here in Poland is unpleasant. The German term was unangenehm. That's the one comment in awful letters, he said, that actually in any way referred to what he was doing in Poland there. Another niece wrote to me and said, what did I know about her uncle? And I relayed to her that his claim was that he had been a non-shooter, and other people had verified that. And she wrote back, said, well, that's not the whole truth. In fact, he told my father late at night after returning from on leave, he did confess that he had shot one Jew and then wouldn't do it after. He was one of those that dropped out after one experience. And then later, the others who said he didn't shoot were telling the truth. I mean, it was a case where he was someone telling to the interrogators, telling the truth about what the battalion had done, but fudging on his own personal involvement, at least at the beginning. So his testimony mostly contained the truth. That his testimony was much of the truth, much of the time, but not all of the truth all of the time, which for an historian is still important. We can't be purists, and we do have to take all the documents we work with are problematic, and anybody that writes down stuff, memoirs, or whatever else, are often doing that in a self-serving way. We have to use it critically, but it doesn't mean we can't use it. And so here was a case where somebody was most of the time telling the truth, but on one very important minor detail, his own legal culpability, in fact, did tell someone in his family, but did not tell it to the prosecutors.
Wow. I can't imagine receiving a letter like that, or letters like that. But did you sense that they felt some sense of closure from their interaction with you, or?
Oh, one certainly was intrigued that she went on to do much more research about somebody in her family, and even published a whole article in a German newspaper about the difference between, I guess, her brother and her uncle, and why one turned out to be such a terrible SS killer, and the other turned out to remained a kind of anti-Nazi, and trying to look at what's the fork in the road, why one went one way and one went the other. So she was very frank about. She wasn't coming up for family history. My book helped spur her to pursue that whole question further, and gave her a kind of starting point to do her own family history.
You mentioned earlier on that these men committed, some of the most horrendous crimes against humanity. Yet at first they didn't want to. What leads a person psychologically to go down that route of murder?
Yeah, we of course wish we could put these people on the couch and talk to them individually and explore that in depth. That's not the record that I have. What I have are judicial investigators trying to extract from these men the statements that they can use as evidence against the officers who they're trying to prosecute. So they want to keep their witnesses comfortable and friendly. So they are not asking them, why did you kill? What's wrong with you? How could you possibly have done that? So again, it's a source that is unique and invaluable, but it's not a complete source. It has lots of areas that the investigators did not pursue in terms of personal motivation that I wish that they had, but that wasn't their job. And they didn't. They were trying to get their job done, which was collect evidence to conduct a trial. So we're left with fragments. And I think in any case, given that the men, responded with kind of a spectrum of behavior, all the way from the most enthusiastic, sadistic killers to the people that said I wouldn't do it, that we also have to deal with a multiple causation and multiple motivations, that a number of different factors are at work. And I put forward at least that one major broad set of factors are what I called the group dynamic of the battalion. deference to authority. They don't like to challenge the authority, their officers and others. Peer pressure and comradeship. They don't want to be seen as letting down their comrades or not taking their fair share of not challenging their buddies. Remember, they're an occupied country. This is the only social life they have. To be a pariah in that group in the middle of occupied territory, who's going to be a friend? Who are you going to talk to if you've alienated the comrades around you? So peer pressure becomes vastly intensified in a small unit like that in occupied territory. And role adaptation. That is, for many of the men, the question was not what I should do on my own moral code, but what is expected of me as a good reserve policeman serving his country in war. And so you allow the government and the expectations of what people do in uniform to set your standards as opposed to what your own personal inclinations may be. And so I said that role adaptation, peer pressure, deference to authority are major ways that shape the way people in this kind of situation interact with one another. Now, beyond that, of course, there are also what we would call the kind of collective mentality and the ideological issues. These people have been in a society that from 1933 to 1942 has engaged in a nonstop defamation of Jews. They framed a whole world in which the Jews are the arch enemy of Germany. And these men wouldn't have to have been arch anti-Semites to have almost marinated, one might say, and absorbed by osmosis this anti-Semitic atmosphere which the government is pumping out nonstop. And so they don't have to be anti-Semitic zealots to have been desensitized, to have reached the point that they can put Jews and Poles outside their community of human obligation. That is, the people for whom their moral codes will apply will be their fellow Germans, and people outside that in this war for struggle for survival that Germany is engaged in are people they can't care about. And one of the questions we often have, is what did these people think about the people they were killing? My own feeling is they thought much more about themselves than about their victims. There was, am I going to be tough enough? Am I going to hold up? The problem was they didn't think about their victims. Mm-hmm. Their victims were not within their world of moral concern. Now, this was certainly fostered by German, the ethos of the German army and not just the Nazi regime, but the German army itself. I first encountered this when I was looking at the German occupation of Serbia, which took place in the spring of 1941, before they invaded the Soviet Union, and where the Germans first started to engage in these, or not first, but when it made a quantum leap towards the kinds of atrocities they had committed in the Soviet Union, including where the army, not the SS, but the army shot all the male Jews and Gypsies in Serbia in the fall of 1941. And did so as a, quote, retaliation for the partisan attacks upon the German army. But even before they began shooting Jews, their first response was if local civilians attacked the German army, then you slaughter the village or the town from where the attack came. You carry out a collective responsibility, a collective retaliation. And I remember reading the command of the German field marshal in Serbia, in which he's sending out what was called a punitive expedition, a punishment expedition to the countryside, in which he orders the men to carry out the punishment on the entire population. So he's ordering them to ignore the distinction between combatant and non-combatant. Women, children, and civilians are to be the target of this punitive expedition because they support the partisans hide among them, that they have to be punished, and they had to be deterred from providing, as Mao Zedong said, the sea in which the gorilla fish swim. And then he went on to say, and this we have in writing, this is yet not an issue of killing Jews, this is killing Serbs, in which he says, anyone who has false humanitarian feelings and doesn't want to do this sins against the life of their comrades. To kill women and children is the moral obligation. To not kill women and children is to sin against your comrade and to be immoral. So you've created an absolutely inverse moral world. You've turned the moral world upside down, in which to murder in women and children is the moral thing to do, and to not do so is a sin against your comrades, because the world of your comrades, the world of Germans, is the only people to whom you have a moral obligation. So that's the Nazi world of morality, in a sense, these people are living in. And while many of them may not have wanted to kill Jews and thought it was dirty, very few of them thought what they were doing was criminal. It was a dirty business. It was not a criminal business. They didn't think of themselves as criminal. They thought of themselves as unfortunate. I got this bad task. After the war, the mood that prevails in the interrogations is not remorse. It's not pity for the people that they have done this to. It is self-pity, a double self-pity. I was so unlucky to get this terrible assignment that I had to go off to Poland and shoot people and get my uniform bloody at point blank range when I blew people's heads off. And then 20 years later, somebody changed the rules and said what I did was criminal, and now I'm in court. How unfair. I am so unlucky. So there's not a thought for their victims. These are the most self-centered, self-pitying kinds of accounts that one can find, because that's who they were thinking about. They had excluded the victims for the most part from their view, and it was themselves that they thought about. And the overriding ethos was self-pity, not remorse or guilt at what they had done.
Wow. That's something. But yeah, so maybe to pivot a little bit, what lessons can we learn from your book and from Police Battalion 101 that we can and should apply today? Because before you answer the question, because it seems to me that history is always taught as a list of events and things that occurred, but without practical applicability, and like people don't really know how to apply whatever they just learned. How can we work to prevent future acts like this, or in general, what can we learn from this?
Yeah, I think what we learn is how important, in a sense, the political ethos is that we live in, and what we accept as norms, and what we would find as impermissible transgressions of norms.
Mm-hmm.
So in this regard, if one's asking me what are the two most important things one can do as a preventative, one is to defend a democratic political culture. One thing that I think we learn from this, and we can learn from other genocidal histories, is any regime that wants to commit genocide is not going to fail to do so for a shortage of executioners. The bottleneck is never being unable to find people to pull the trigger. People are very malleable, and if you organize them and train them and set the situation up, you can get people to kill other human beings in very large numbers. And that, say, genocidal regime will not fail because they don't find people who will kill on their behalf. So preserving a democratic regime that doesn't want to commit genocide, that considers genocide an impermissible crime, a transgression that cannot be crossed, is very important. You have to preserve the norms that a democratic society considers human life valuable and equal. You can't target certain groups and put them outside the moral universal moral obligation and not care about what happens to them. The second is institutional culture. And here in particular is the institutional culture of our military and our police and any unit that might be used in this way. And I'm very glad to say that at the various military academies, at times, Ordinary Men has been used at West Point and Annapolis and at the Air Force Academy. And one of my grad students who's gone on to get his PhD has written a whole kind of unit study that is used at West Point now that looks at another case of the German Wehrmacht army involvement in atrocities in the Soviet Union. So it's trying to, in a sense, make officers aware of what kind of abuses can happen and what standards you need to have, what institutional culture has to be maintained if you don't fall into the not to kill others is a sin against my comrades, and to know how to forestall that kind of ethos where that kind of thing is acceptable. So how we train our armies and how we insist that our officer corps have to have a consciousness of this, one, to be aware of how a military can be abused, how in the hands of certain governments they can be used to do these kinds of things. They have to be aware of, and they have to be aware of the situations. So if they ever encounter this kind of thing, they don't have to invent the wheel. That they can understand what the necessary and suitable appropriate response is. So I think we have to maintain institutional cultures in our institutions that have the power to do this. And above all, we have to maintain an overall democratic culture that values life and upholds certain moral standards that cannot be transgressed, even by a government proclaiming that in this case, they have to do it for whatever particular reason.
Yeah. I remember I heard about your book for the first time in a conversation on a different podcast between Jocko Willink, who's a decorated Navy SEAL, and Jordan Peterson, who's a clinical psychologist. And I'm sure you heard a lot of people come to your book from him. And Jocko Willink talked about the fact that the lessons from your book have been applied in the military. And one of the, I'm not sure if this is a direct consequence of reading your book, but General Petraeus in Iraq used to said we shouldn't just bomb places and leave them be. It's more of like coming up and doing community work, getting these people on our side, because if we just bomb them, we're no better than the people that we're fighting against. We're creating more enemies than we're creating friends. So I definitely think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from your book. The to begin to wrap up, the last two questions I ask of all my guests is I'm going to ask them together, and you can answer them in whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? And the second one is, what are 5 books on any topic, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Oh, okay. Hope for the future. I guess I would be ranked more on the pessimistic than the optimistic side, but that doesn't mean one throws up one's hands and gives up. In terms of our current situation in the United States, I do think we have a democracy under siege. I do think that we are facing a situation where the viability of our democratic system, particularly as an electoral system, which is the core of popular sovereignty and holding governments responsible, is under grave peril. And if I'm often asked, what parallels do I see from the 30s or the 20s and 30s to the present, if I wanted in a very short capsule to give the lessons from Weimar, it would be basically this. Between 1919 and 1923, Weimar was under constant attack by the big lie. The big lie then was that Germany had not lost World War I, but they'd been betrayed at the home front, and that the Weimar Republic was the traitorous government put in place by having brought about Germany's defeat and collapse. It's an alien imposition. It's a proof of German defeat. The next step was try to overthrow that illegitimate government, the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, which failed. There was then a trial in which Hitler, in this case, was convicted, But the real punishment for Hitler would have been to end his political career by, as a alien felon, expel him to Austria and to end his German career. But that was not done. There was a chance to end Hitler once and for all by kicking him out of the country. But like another impeachment trial that did not end the political career of another unnamed man, Hitler was left to fight another day. At which he then proclaimed that we know beer hall putsch doesn't work. An attack upon the Capitol in Munich, town hall, didn't work. So now we will carry out the legal revolution. And the legal revolution, in a sense, was to use the freedoms that Weimar Constitution gave to overthrow that Constitution, come to power in a way that, in a sense, paralyzed anybody's ability to challenge your coming to power. Hitler does not seize power by force. Hitler does not win an election. Hitler is appointed as an emergency chancellor by the president under his emergency powers of the Constitution. They were there supposedly to protect democracy against its enemies. He appointed an enemy of democracy who would overturn democracy from within. But when I look about all of these different legislation that's now being put forward, this is the legal revolution. This is an attempt to take over our legislative process so that state legislatures with Republican majorities can overturn the elections that have the results they do not want, to deny the sending of electoral delegations for the opposition, to throw the presidential election into the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote and Republicans have a built-in majority to illegally elect the next president, even if he doesn't win by millions and millions of votes. This is a real prospect. This is what the blueprint is. This is what the plan is now for the legal revolution to install minority rule in the United States. And I'm terrified of it. I look at that and I say, we can just see so clearly what's coming. And what 2022 will be kind of the trial run. And 2024 is going to be the contested election, which half the country will not accept, whoever comes out of it. And American democracy is going to face a crisis like 1860. We'll have two countries and two presidents. And where do we go from there? So that's my pessimism. The answer of why that might not be, well, it might be that, in fact, if we manage to ward off all of these subversions of democracy, if we get courts to overturn some, if we get legislation in Congress by one way or another that curb the worst attempts of this legislation to subvert election, we could have a fair election in 2024 that will keep us going. So that is my hope and my grounds for tenuous optimism that as long as you can still fight the political battle, you keep fighting it. Now, as for books, in terms of the Holocaust, of course, the book that was most important to me was Raoul Hilberg's Destruction of the European Jews. That is a monumental book that sort of founded the field in the United States. And it's a book that's still widely cited, still widely used. It's now, he wrote 3 different editions. The third is basically a 3-volume, thousands of pages one. So it's not a light read, it's not a casual read, but for devotees, it is, in a sense, one of the foundational works of Holocaust studies. In terms of the many very important memoirs, Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, I think, is, for me, still the most insightful, most thoughtful, in terms of a very reflective and superb writer trying to capture, in a sense, this upside-down moral world for the prisoners of Auschwitz. I've talked about it in terms of the German army, but this whole inversion of morality that the Nazis create, I think, is captured there, I think, very, very well. Let me think of some more.
It'd be fiction. So if you want to throw in a fiction book.
I'm kind of blanking on this right now. I guess the fiction I've found more successful, Holocaust fiction is very hard to write. Uh, uh, I found that World War I novels capturing World War I think, have been much more successful than Holocaust novels trying to capture the Holocaust. Um, uh, so I mean, there's some that have been there. One of the most notorious ones was the one written in France that is trying to capture the perpetrator. And I'm blanking on the title right now. But it was a case, often historical fiction is good on the creation of the characters, but pretty bad on its historical foundations.
You're talking about All Quiet on the Eastern Front?
No, now I'm back to Holocaust.
Oh, wow, sorry.
Yeah. No, All Quiet on the Western Front, that would certainly be my example of a very successful war novel. But in this one on the Holocaust, rare case where the man writing it did a superb job on the historical background, reading all sorts of history. And you read it, I can even say, well, he got this from so and so. I can see where he lifted his historical background, but his actual fictional characters are less believable, and the plot is not very plausible. So it was in terms of historical fiction, the historical part was much more successful than the fictional part, which is, as to say, the inverse of most historical fiction. In terms of trying to capture, in a sense, the multiplicities of the Holocaust, that is a book that's written from capturing both the German documents and planning and the Jewish experience, what we often now refer to as attempts at an integrated history of the Holocaust. How do you bring all of these different perspectives together? I think the first attempt at that really mastered the German documents, but intimately knew the Jewish side because it was written by a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, was Israel Gutman's The Jews of Warsaw, written in the 1980s. The man who took that to the kind of the next stage to write a kind of comprehensive history of the Holocaust was Shaul Friedlander's 2-volume work on Nazis and Jews, the years of persecution and the years of extermination, in which it is this, what I call it is kind of a mosaic. And that is, you get all of these different episodes of sort of snapshots of different German perpetrators, different Jewish experiences, all put together in a kind of overall pattern to create this amazing mosaic that if you look up real close, you see each little piece. If you stand back, then you get the whole stunning effect. And so that certainly has been a milestone in Holocaust historiography as well.
Wonderful. Before we sign off for the day, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast, taking the time to speak with me. I consider it a privilege and an honor anytime somebody comes on and is way smarter than me and knows is an expert in their field. So thank you for writing this book. I'll show it one more time, Ordinary Men. Thank you for your work, and thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, my pleasure.